Welcome to the Irish NFL show and to our divisional previews. We're taking the time in the off-season to look ahead to what's going to happen in 2024-2025. We've already wrapped the NFC. If you want to check out any of those previous off-season previews, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts. And please do remember to like and subscribe. But we're turning our attention now to the AFC North, where all four teams had winning records last year, probably the most formidable division, all things considered, in the NFL. The Bengals, the only team to miss out on the playoffs, and will count themselves pretty unfortunate with the injury luck they had, particularly with Joe Burrow going down at such an early stage of the season. But we'll get to them eventually. We look firstly in this division to the champions last year, the Baltimore Ravens, who of course went out at home in the playoffs to the Kansas City Chiefs, but still managed to finish 13-4. I've made a couple of interesting divisions, Brian, in the offseason, not least Derrick Henry, which was a signing everybody expected and is a little bit excited about.
Yeah, I'm a bit torn on this one, to be honest, Conor. Like, he's a fantastic signing in his own right, but I would say over the course of the last 3 years, we've kind of, I wouldn't say the skids have come off, but you can certainly see the wear and tear of his heavy load, which has been expected of him in Tennessee, kind of catching up on him. He hasn't been the player in which we saw a couple of years ago, which many had him then being selected in their fantasy drafts as the number one pick standout. The last couple of years, he's had a difficult time in Tennessee. Maybe the fresh start in Baltimore will work for him, but Baltimore have kind of moved away from me as a run-heavy type team. I know maybe the numbers might not stack that up, but this time last year, Lamar was getting the contract and they were doing their utmost to kind of put players around him. And I felt we saw a bit more of an expansive offense last year with various different players. That, you know, a rookie wide receiver comes in immediately, has a huge impact. I don't think the Odell Beckham signing necessarily worked, but I suppose he brought experience to the team. And I'd be interested to see, how does Derrick Henry fit into an offense where the quarterback does predominantly a lot of the running?
But Brian, I'd agree with all of that, and we got to see them in the flesh last year in London as well. And we talked several times after that game about how impressed we were with the restraint and the patience, and with the fact that Lamar wasn't pulling the trigger and pulling the ball in and going running. He was waiting for things to happen, and he was trusting in the scheme and trusting receivers to get open. And they had a much more balanced look about them, and the whole move of OC and move away from the Greg Roman scheme seemed to really be working for them. And then, ironically, you know, you look to their playoff defeat and you're saying this is the one time when they needed to take the shackles off Lamar. And he seemed to be slightly apprehensive about it. Maybe he'd gotten out of practice over the course of the season, or was a little bit torn as to how to go. And it seemed like they got away from the run just at the wrong time.
Yeah, and that game for me was very conducive to a run-oriented game. You know, the Chiefs, you know, they played well in the first. Chiefs didn't score in the second half in that entirety of the game. I don't think they racked up many first downs. So their defense kind of pulled them back into the game, and they kind of got away from what they'd done over the course of those few weeks leading up to it. Was a kind of a balanced offensive run with it. You know, when you throw in what you touched on there, and the kind of experience in which Lamar is now kind of building up on the patience and getting wide receivers into the game and getting tight ends. I mean, you bring back Mark Andrews for the playoffs as well, such a huge key. He was kind of a huge loss to them, albeit it didn't really affect the results, but he was such a pivotal part of the team, and they got him back at the right time. You felt it would work in the playoffs, in particular for the championship game. Didn't materialise, and when you look at how dominant they were against the Texans team in the divisional round, and a lot of people felt that would be the same against the Chiefs, but they got away from it very early. The early touchdown from Lamar, you know, they had to throw, and it brings them back into the game, but nothing ever went right after that, and they kind of got into panic mode in the second half. He had a number of interceptions, which we just didn't see from him last year. As you said, in the game in particular in London, and they moved on over the course of the season, a real patient player that, you know, became the MVP for numerous reasons. It wasn't to be in that playoff game. It was disappointing. And you'd wonder, like, we speak about teams over the course of the last 4 to 5 years who look back, and the Bengals may look back and say, God, we should have beaten the Rams in the Super Bowl. We missed an opportunity there. I think the Ravens will be kicking themselves that they didn't get the opportunity to go against a Niners team who they'd only beaten 4 weeks earlier in Santa Clara. It would have been a huge opportunity for them to finally win the Super Bowl again. It wasn't to be.
Shane, you paused the season at a certain point, and Brian is kind of alluding to it there, and the Ravens were the best team in the NFL. They'd smashed the Lions, they'd beaten the Niners, they looked absolutely formidable, everything firing on all cylinders. It didn't happen for them, obviously, in the playoffs, but which is the real version of Baltimore? Is it the team that we saw dominant in the regular season, or is it the team that we saw that got just gun shy at the wrong time in the playoffs?
Sometimes the Ravens kind of remind me of Manchester City a couple of years ago, when in the Champions League, Pep Guardiola managed to overthink things consistently in a way that they kept falling in the Champions League, but yet in the Premiership, they were just a completely dominant team against everybody who were winning 5-6-7-0 or whatever against the likes of your Burnleys and whatever. I think the Ravens are a little bit like that, and Lamar Jackson in particular is a little bit like that. We saw he's put in 2 MVP caliber seasons. He's been incredibly strong every year we've seen him. That game in London, he kind of needed to bounce back against one maybe shoddy performance against in Pittsburgh, when, to be fair, none of the Ravens' offense could really catch anything that Lamar was throwing. But once they built into the season, they are incredibly strong. But then you look at Lamar, and he has a 2-4 record in the playoffs. I'm not quite sure what it is mentally that they just seem to find some way to lose their bottle. And in the AFC Championship game last year, like, I think it's fair to say that they completely shit the bed in terms of their game plan. Not only in terms of Lamar Jackson and the way that individuals have performed throughout, but I think the entire game plan. I'm not quite sure whether there's something about the Chiefs which made them, I guess, completely miscalculate how it is to come against them. I think they were playing the opponents too much rather than leaning into their own strengths, and that is that's the tricky thing when it comes to judging what the Ravens can do. We saw the Ravens the year beforehand when the Bengals ended up winning the division. They came through the season particularly strong, but the wheels kind of fell off at the end a little bit. They came into last season. I didn't think we're as favorites to win the division, but built it up incredibly. And now going into this season, I think they are in a pretty good spot to top the division, but you don't trust them when they get into the playoffs to deliver when it matters. And that's the thing. You have to remember as well that, you know, they're coming in with a new defensive coordinator as well. Zach Orr, I think, is the second youngest coordinator in the league as well. He'll also take time to develop. I'm not quite sure whether he'll have the experience to have the right kind of play calls when we get into those playoff situations. So I expect the Ravens will be in. So to answer your question, I don't know which one is the real Ravens. They will consistently show up their potential. Lamar in particular will show up their incredibly high potential, but they haven't shown the ability to really put things over in the playoffs. And I think one thing that we've seen come against them too much is the over-reliance on Lamar Jackson. We've seen it in a couple of other teams, and we've seen the only team I know that has a almost exclusive reliance on one player and has managed to make it work is the Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes. I think that the running back acquisitions in Baltimore now are a sign that Baltimore realize that they probably need to diversify their game a little bit. You know, the player with the most rushing yards in the AFC Championship game wasn't the running back; it was Lamar Jackson. Somebody else has to take at least some of that carry in, especially when we get into those winter games against tough defenses that the Chiefs are going to put up, tough defenses that the other AFC North teams are going to put up. The AFC we know is very tricky. And the AFC North is a division where things are earned through tough, hard, sometimes not attractive football. You can't always be on one man all the time. So I think for Lamar and for the Ravens to gain some success later into the season, they need to start sharing the workload a little bit more. Then the Ravens we see in the regular season and the Ravens we see in the postseason might actually have a chance of being the real Ravens. We'll see what they really are and what they really can do across the board.
No, they're coming off a 13-win team there, and Shane is kind of touching on it in a 13-win season, rather. Shane is kind of touching on it a little bit there. You can't take anything for granted in the AFC North in particular, and it's proven difficult for teams to hold on to and to repeat as champions year in, year out. So there's no guarantee, for all the talk of whether Baltimore are positioned to go one better or two better next year, whether they'll even be able to get back to the same standard. I mean, you think about what they had around them last year. You have the Bengals down Joe Burrow. You have the Steelers who didn't really have a quarterback. You had the Browns who lost Watson and had to have Joe Flacco in relief, although that worked out pretty well in the end. They could be facing a very difficult task to just hold on to the division crown, never mind go one further.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is such a tough division for any team to win. I mean, we look at it, the team that finished bottom had 9 wins. You know, it's just such a crazy kind of stat to look at. And I mean, the Ravens have made some changes this year. Obviously, we've talked about Derrick Henry coming in. You know, he could be hit or miss. He is an absolute battering ram. And if he gets a bit of momentum past that line of scrimmage, he can be unstoppable. But then, you know, Brian talked about wear and tear. So, you know, maybe that's an issue. Jackson has come back a little bit lighter. So, you know, maybe they'll complement each other. Maybe they will look to run Jackson a little bit more, and that can give Henry a bit of space. I also look at the offensive line. They've taken 3 of those starters from last year out, and replace them. So that in itself is going to be interesting to see, because obviously that has a massive bearing on Henry and Lamar Jackson and how they're protected and if they're given space. So yeah, this is a very good Ravens team. I think they are a really good team. I think they will win the division. But in this division, it's absolutely not guaranteed, and they will need to be at top performance to do it, because there are 2, potentially 3 teams in this division who really could look at the game wins they had last year and think they could go 1 or 2 better. And if the Ravens have any sort of switch off at all and drop back 1 or 2, then you start to see teams flip in position. And it's going to be interesting to see, because it is, I think both North divisions are probably 2 of the best divisions in football. And I think that's fairly being called out. And I know a lot of people would go for this one as the strongest. And you can see that argument made because, again, all 4 teams had such great records last year and have potentially such good players going forward. But it's just a matter of, obviously, new season, new start. And we'll see if they kind of pick it up and go again for this season.
All right, we shall see whether or not the Ravens manage to remain kings in the North next year. Brian, you wanted to make a point before we move on to the Browns.
Sorry, just a quick one. You look at the schedule. Sometimes the schedule is more important, when you start the season. You go into Kansas City week 1, and then they've got a nice one against the Raiders, you could argue, but week 3 in Dallas, that's another tough one. Like, they kind of started last year with, I wouldn't say a soft schedule, but they got off to a good start into Texans week 1, and they kind of moved on from there. This season, it's not as straightforward for them. They've got some really difficult games early on in the season. You'd be interested to see how they adapt to that and where they are come week 5, week 6, when it starts to really